When CSS rules clash, that is, when there's more than one CSS rule telling an HTML element how to style itself, we need to have a way to determine which one a web browser should go with. One of those ways to determine that is by looking at Cascade theory. According to this theory, the order and placement of rules in the style sheet or on the page affects the application of styling. And closely related to this concept of Cascade theory would be the concept of proximity rules. If a particular CSS rule is close to a particular element, then that's the one that the web browser is going to go with. The closer it is, then the more likely that that is the one that it's going to use. So to illustrate, let's look at Cascade.html. We have 3 different CSS rules here telling this particular H1 what color to make itself. We have one that tells it to make it blue, red, black, or green. So the web browser is going to have to come up with something. And when we preview this, you can see that it's in green. And the reason for that has to do with proximity rules. The CSS rule closest to the element is this inline styling right here, which tells it to make itself green. And that's why it's in green. So when we take this out, take out the inline CSS, what we are left with is the embedded style sheet. So let's see what happens. Without the inline CSS, now it's in black. Of course, the default is black, so it's kind of hard to determine if it's the browser default doing it or if it's the internal style sheet doing it. So let's get rid of this one right here. One way to think of it though is that this H1 color black is closest to H1 compared to color blue and color red, and that's why it's going with that. But to illustrate that more, let's comment this out to where color red is now the closest to H1. So this CSS rule that says to make it color red, that's now closer. Let's save that. Refresh the preview, and now it's in red. And that's because it's the closest to that. Another way of looking at it, though, is that the H1 color red is what was declared last. So whatever is declared last is what your browser is going to go with. So if I were to do something like this, H1 color, I'm running out of colors here. Let's try orange. It's going to go with the color orange because it's the closest, but it's also the last declaration of what color H1 should be. Okay, so what about if we have external and internal styling going on? Let's look at lab 2 for that. Let's do something with H1 right here. In the embedded portion, in the embedded style sheet, we're telling it to make the font weight normal. But what if we put in H1 in the external style sheet? What if we tell it to make the font weight bold? Save that. Right now, this is the preview, but we made that change. We made it say font weight bold for H1. When we refresh that, nothing happens. And the reason for that has to do with Cascade theory. Let's look at the code. When your web browser reads this HTML file, it's going to read the external style sheet first. So it's going to say H1 font weight bold. But then when it's done reading the external style sheet, then it runs into the embedded style sheet. And in this embedded style sheet, it says to make the font weight normal. So that's why it's going to go with normal. But what if it reads the embedded style sheet first, and then reads the external style sheet next. So let's move the link element to where it will be that. It'll read this embedded style sheet first, and then it will go with the external style sheet. So let's save that, refresh, and now we have our H1 in bold because it was read last.